Hello, Professor Crosstrack. Welcome to see my final project that I will be doing for this class, and hello to my other classmates. What I am going ahead and decided to do as my final project was actually to go ahead and focus on using one of the current skill sets I was learning in another class this semester and apply it to something that I learned during this course. This I ended up choosing was to go ahead and make a replica of stained glass pieces. Instead of using glass, I went ahead and used watercolor as my piece. Now, of course, we gotta go ahead and talk about stained glasses first and their use in medieval Europe before we get to the dive in of my speed paintings and drawings to see how I went ahead and did them. So to really go ahead and talk about really what stained glasses windows were used for, they were had it to where their utility and beauty have always been used since back in ancient Rome, and they always had it to where they were particularly popular in more of church buildings, as you always see them in film, in pictures, and even if you yourself are a avid religious goer, depending on your religion, you would see them out there too. They would have it to where with this was mainly having it to where the most medieval well-known stained glass makings came from a 12th century German monk who called himself Theophilus. And these would just have it to where the main purpose of these stained glasses, as we see in some of the examples up here, were to go ahead and depict main storylines of whatever your religion was to go ahead and capture, or mainly to go ahead and have them as pieces of lessons for people to go ahead and see them. This is used as a way to be both artistic, but also be very informative and visual, as that was one way a lot of people were able to go ahead and understand religion easier compared to those who were like the priests or monks who would have a lot more education, be able to read, whereas around that time, it was not that common for people to really have the capability to read. So I'm gonna think the two paintings I end up going ahead and do is actually right here. They Saint Nicholas accuses the consul from scenes of the life of Saint Nicholas, and I also did one of King Louis carrying the crown of thorns. Now, the main reason why I went ahead and do these two different types of pieces was simply of the fact of how varying their line weight was, and of the fact that they both had it to where they have very interesting stories. First off, with the King Louis, they had it to where with King Louis of France from 1226 to 1270, later St. Louis undertook two crusades to the Holy Land. So this is around the time of the Crusades, but both were made around similar time frames. And this would go ahead and show pieces where they would go ahead and have acquired relics of Christ's passion from his own cousin, a Latin emperor, Constantinople Baldwin II, and most notably a piece of the true cross, also known as the crown of thorns. He brought these relics to Paris, and he had also installed them in a Saintine chapel. So this was really interesting to go ahead and put a piece of this, as this really crosses into multiple points of histories, kind of give an example of what was some of the events happening during the Crusades, but also really going ahead and being poignant as far as how much art had really moved around and how many works were moved around depending on big events. And the other one of St. Nicholas, this one was done around the time of 1200 to 1210, so much before the King Louis event. This had it to where this scene illustrates an early episode of the life of St. Nicholas himself after he was elected to be Bishop of Myra in Asia Minor for 4th century. It is really interesting to go ahead and see with the identifications of the knights and how they were being falsely accused of treason and condemned by the council. And it was just mainly depicting a scene of some of the corruption that would go ahead and be showcased during times like this. Because in both the Crusades and in both this piece, I really saw how I felt like during the medieval times those in certain powers, whether it was by royalty or in this case by religion and being higher places in religion, unfortunately, some people will use that power for a little bit of more evil with the power of their influence, and mainly going ahead and just using this as a term point lesson of being careful with the responsibility and power that it can get to you and how that can really create a whole lot of terrible events to be affected. Alrighty, so what I'm going to go ahead and showcase next is going to be of my videos of what I went ahead and did. This is going to mainly go through the walkthrough of everything that I went ahead and how I painted everything. To start off, I always have it to where I have my reference video and an iPad always by me, and I always try to do a sketch layer first and start with that afterwards. So as I go ahead and start with this, I usually don't try to go with too much of shapes or line work, as one of the main goals I had while going with these medieval works was to mainly try and follow a lot of the shapes and forms, mainly of very thick line weight, focusing on like how more of the bodies were expression and how bright and vivid the colors are. As with stained glass pieces, they always wanted to have a lot of brighter colors and be used to go ahead and showcase to show important pieces of the story. One thing that was interesting that I noticed as I was going ahead and painting both of these pieces was mainly of the design of the faces and the bodies. The bodies had it to where they weren't really too much anatomically correct, but rather they still got the idea of who they were as people, what the whole point of the event was, and that they had a lot of varying line weight, mainly thicker outline to go ahead and have all the pieces of the glasses hold together. But when you got into faces and outfits, it would show the line work here and it would go ahead and give texture and a lot of influence of movement on there. With the second piece, I actually ended up trying more of the different variation of masses and shapes of what the stained glass was in the background for the King Louis painting. I mainly just had it to where what I was focusing on as I got to this piece was mainly trying to see what I can use as far as to do a different amount of contrast, whether it was by shade, by variant line work, or even if I had it to where in some cases I would just go ahead and change some of the line weights inside or outside to make it a little bit easier to see. But yeah, when you're doing watercolor, the big thing that I have always learned to do is that you always go from light to dark. And then after you would go ahead and go from light to dark, you would build up your layers from there, and you would always have to go ahead and make sure that after you do that, you would have to work with pens that don't really get water soluble so that it wouldn't spread around and smudge the piece. But it was very fun and informative as far as learning the way of making it and kind of giving the idea of like how these were approaches when it was made by stained glass makers of that time. Give me a moment of editing my share screen and then I will go ahead and see if I can change it out. Perfect. Alrighty, so some of the last steps I wanted to go ahead and talk about was mainly the ingredients and things that would be part of a stained glass piece compared to what be the watercolor piece I made, which was mainly paper, having water as the sort of movement for the pigment and paint pieces. And what I would use is pen inks that were not really water soluble, so they were able to be resistant from water, so I didn't have to worry about spreading. Basic ingredients for glass making are sand, wood, and ash or pot ash, and this will go ahead and be mixed into liquid, which will become cooled into glass. And then, depending on what color they wanted, they would have to use certain powder metals and go ahead and add a mixture while it was still molten, basically having it to where different temperatures and different mixtures would render you different colors, which is kind of how heat mainly manipulates a lot of stuff with that. A lot of the ways that glass can go ahead and be used is by like glass blowers with blowing them out, going ahead and putting them onto a round sheet or what's called a crown, and also having it to where that you can go ahead and mainly use different pieces, whether you were pulling them apart or really customizing them. It is something that is very delicate and careful to work for, as you always have to go ahead and work with it between being hot and cold. And sometimes, if you are not careful with that process, it can always risk cracking and damaging it. But it's very interesting seeing that, during the medieval times, along with a lot of paintings, I would say stained glass artworks were probably some of the most important pieces as well, simply because of the fact that they were just so poignant and important pieces that they would be held in churches in higher spots and really just be something that many people can go and see, so that they were probably showing some of the most crucial information that was wanting to be shared. But yeah, that is my final project for everyone. If you guys are wanting to go ahead and see my citations for all of this, I have the citations for both the images along with the stained glass article at the very top. And I appreciate everyone for the semester seeing all the stuff that you guys have made and for the professor for going ahead and teaching us. Thank you, everyone.